Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I am Nitin Gokhale, and today I am delighted to host a webinar, first in a series of such webinars we have planned at StratNews Global to make sense of the world post COVID-19 scenario. And today I am privileged to host two distinguished panelists on this webinar. Parag Khanna, Global Strategy Advisor, best-selling author, and someone who watches geopolitics, especially in Asia, very closely. The other distinguished panelist is Gautam Bambawale, a diplomat who has served as India's ambassador to Bhutan, High Commissioner to Pakistan, and ambassador to China in his last three assignments in a long and distinguished diplomatic career for the Indian Foreign Service. We are trying to understand if China's importance to the global economy and to geopolitics will remain intact or will it diminish? Welcome both of you, and let me start with Gautam to begin with. We are talking about whether China's centrality to geopolitics and global economy will remain intact or will diminish as we go forward. Gautam, you've been watching China, you've been a China specialist for such a long time. In fact, you just wrote a very insightful piece for us about 2 weeks ago. What do you make of the post-COVID scenario geopolitically? Will China continue to dominate and sort of try and set some rules in global order, or do you think that it's going to change?
First of all, let me say I'm delighted to be on this program with you, Nitin, and of course with Parag Khanna out of Singapore. Talking about China itself, we have to keep in mind that this particular event, this pandemic, the COVID, the Wuhan virus, whatever you call it, is one of those black swan events which is going to change the world forever. And the fact that we are sitting in three separate cities and still doing this is going to be increasingly common in the post-virus world. Looking at China itself, I think over the past 40 years, the rise of China has been one of the defining characteristics of the global geopolitics. I don't think the rise of China is going to change. It will continue to rise both economically and militarily, but it would perhaps rise less quickly than it has done in the past 40 years. The reason for that is, of course, that the global economy is being impacted by not merely the virus itself, but also the extensive lockdowns that most societies have had to undertake. And I know that Parag is undergoing one of these lockdowns in Singapore, and we ourselves, Nitin, are undergoing such a lockdown in India. So I think there would be a slowing of China's rise. And one last point that I would like to make is that unfortunately, the one big thing that is coming out of this pandemic is that China's reputation has been badly impacted negatively during the course of this. So that is something which is not factored into any GDP growth figure. It is not factored into comprehensive national power statistics, but it is something which has happened. And therefore, while China will continue to rise, if at a slower pace, I think her reputation has been pretty badly damaged during the course of this. And therefore, perhaps China may have to take a lower profile in international relations post COVID-19, post the Wuhan virus.
That's a great start to the discussion. Parag, let me take it to you. I just read your piece, which you were kind to send it to me about the six things to watch out for post the virus. But let me talk about a bigger picture. Gautam just mentioned about China's reputation taking a hit. But on the economic front, particularly, do you think China's centrality, and given the fact that they are an export-oriented economy, there will be a pushback against China, or they will suffer a lot of slowdown in the economy apart from its reputation taking a hit geopolitically?
It's a very good question, and thank you as well, Nitin, for having me on. I'm honored to be here with Ambassador Gautam to discuss this with you. First, let me say I agree with the propositions that you've laid out. I also agree very much with what Gautam has said. Now, China's growth rate is anticipated to slow to 1% this year, which is obviously the lowest in 4 decades. Also, at the same time, global growth is slowing. Now, we've seen world leaders announce certain stimulus. They have not done so in a coordinated fashion. There is a big difference between synchronized stimulus and coordinated stimulus. The purpose of a coordinated stimulus would be to strengthen global demand such that, in fact, China as a consumer would be purchasing more from Western economies to help them to help cushion their contraction in the economy. That's not what the purpose of China's stimulus is. The purpose of China's stimulus is for its own domestic consumption of its own goods and services to maintain its own high employment levels. Even Japan has announced a very, very large stimulus. The purpose is to shore up Japan, not to promote the imports of foreign goods into Japan. Nothing of the sort. So every country, and obviously the same thing goes for America's stimulus. The purpose is not to get Americans to buy more foreign goods. The purpose is to keep American companies hiring Americans and to get the retail sector thriving again. Now, you mentioned the second point is this. You mentioned China as export-oriented. Actually, China's economy has gone through a very significant transition, and it is now largely a consumption-driven economy. Its export dependence as a share of GDP has come down very, very drastically. It's come down to less than 15% of GDP. So while exports matter because it's part of job creation in the country, it's trying obviously to sell its own goods into markets where it's open to with Belt and Road and trade agreements and so forth. At the same time, it can sustain its domestic transformation and its growth without the world economy recovering and being dependent on its exports. The final point on this is just, again, the image issue. And I think this is extremely important. The three of us understand this very well because we are based here in Asia. We are China's neighbors. And therefore, we view China with the suspicion that most of Asia does. So to the three of us, I imagine, it seems rather comical, literally comical, to see how in New York or in London you hear people saying on Twitter that China has launched a propaganda war and it's winning and it's convincing people in Italy and in South Africa and in Brazil that Chinese goodwill is part of the solution to the problem. The majority of the human population on this planet Earth is Asians. None of us have any doubt or could ever be persuaded otherwise as to the origin of this virus. And therefore, it is completely tautological that China's reputation will take a very substantial hit, and that suspicion of China at the very high level that it already was will only be higher moving forward.
Very interesting point, Parag. In fact, I want to take that to Gautam because he's watched China for so long and has been, as I mentioned, ambassador to China. China always had this carrot and stick policy with its neighbors, especially the smaller neighbors in Asia. And also, it had deep pockets. It has used its deep pockets to gain influence in Asia. And the same tactics is now being tried elsewhere in Europe and in South America and in the US also. But given the fact that this virus, which has originated in China, has also given rise to suspicions, as we all agree upon. Will there be a pushback and will there be rise of nationalism in countries other than China, or will China also sort of start using the tool of nationalism to sell it to its own people? I mean, there are two questions in this, actually, Gautam, for you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. And, the way I look at it is that while China's reputation has taken a hit, I don't think any one of us in Asia and beyond probably, we are not trying to, blame a particular country or a particular people for this whole pandemic. The very fact is that the world is much more integrated today than it ever was. We're much more interdependent than it ever was. So wherever this virus started, it would have spread, and it would have probably led to a similar kind of pandemic. But I think what is going to happen is that economically, you are already seeing firms, both international as well as Asian, who are beginning. They were originally talking for China plus one model. This was even before the pandemic and many years before the pandemic. I think this whole process is being accelerated as a result of this pandemic. That increasingly Japanese, Korean, American, Italian, German companies are going to look for other places where they could manufacture beyond China. And the Japanese government, Abe's government, Prime Minister Abe's government, has already announced a certain amount of money to help Japanese firms do so. So I think this process is going to be accelerated, and you'll find that firms will be moving to Vietnam or Malaysia, and hopefully even India. And I can share with you, Nitin, that I interact with many people in amongst the states of India, amongst the state governments of India, and I can tell you that many of them are already onto this possibility and are working on getting some of these companies, whether they're Korean or Japanese or American or British or German, to get them to India if possible. So this is a trend which is very highly likely to get accelerated as a result of this pandemic.
I'll just
Come back to you, Parag. Just let him finish this thing on nationalism that I spoke about.
right.
Gautam,
No,
yeah.
on nationalism, I think, nationalism was on the rise even before the pandemic. There might be a little bit of increase in nationalism, but I think the fact is that the world today is highly interlinked. And if we have to fight pandemics, or if we have to fight climate change, for example, the world needs to come together to do so. And therefore, there will be aspects of nationalism and looking inwards amongst societies and countries, but there'll also be aspects of where countries have to work with each other, and societies have to work with each other, and people have to work with each other in order to tackle these problems of humanity as a whole.
True. It's very important. But Parag, you wanted to make a point.
Just to add some data to this issue about the diversion of investment out of China, because when we look back, we shouldn't say that it was because of the pandemic or even necessarily the US China trade war, though that obviously was a stimulant as well. But Japan began to significantly draw down its investment into China in the year 2010, 10 years ago. And that was because of the dispute about rare earth mineral exports. When China threatened that, that was also a time when there was flare-ups over the Senkaku Islands and other sorts of bilateral tensions. That's when China began to say, Japan, sorry, began to say, it's too expensive in China anyway. You cannot have your intellectual property protected here. The markets of Southeast Asia and India are growing. The labor costs there are cheaper. Let's start to shift very significantly. That was accelerated by the trade war, and it will be accelerated by the pandemic and the provisions that governments are making. So just to be clear that exactly as Gautam has said, this is an accelerating trend, but one that was very, very strong already. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines have been very significant beneficiaries. India can be as well. It's not at all too late. However, it will require a couple of things. India, of course, did not join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It has good reason not to because of the fact that the agreement doesn't cover software exports. So it's a logical position that the Indian government took. However, it does then have to make an extra effort to have the kinds of trade and investment agreements with the US, with the EU, in order to make the market more attractive. And I think that is, again, it's not at all too late. But if we look at where foreign investment into India is, it's very low. It's not nearly as high as it should be, given the alignment of the stars, given the low wage, given the large youth population, given the large market. So this is what you would call a self-inflicted wound, right? India's regulations, investment laws, these kinds of things. we have to make sure, India has to make sure that it's not its own worst enemy here at a time when it should be much more attractive for companies to be doing this kind of work in India.
I think that's a great advice to the Indian government and especially to the state governments who have to do the heavy lifting. As Gautam mentioned, industrialized states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Telangana, they'll have to do the heavy lifting going forward, reforming the laws, the land reforms, all that will have to come in there. But on that point, Parag, again, I want to take up something with you before I go back to Gautam. Is will also the change scenario force the Chinese government to also relook at its own laws, its own business scenario or intellectual property, the legal system which is opaque? Will they reform that? Do you think will this pandemic and the change situation force them to do that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the money talks more than the pandemic, right, as far as China is concerned. So, for example, when they see capital outflows, when they see foreign investment coming out, then they act only as a last resort. So, there are a couple of examples there. They have been, because since the trade war broke out in 2017, they have been creating much stronger incentives for American hardware technology companies to stay in the country. So more favorable joint venture terms, ensure that the high-tech semiconductor manufacturers stay in the market and so forth, offering a bit more IP protection, a bit, tax breaks and these kinds of things. In fact, they declared zero tax on profits to companies that will invest in some of the strategic sectors declared by the Made in China 2025 initiative. So again, all of these things predate the pandemic very, very substantially. So that's one. Another is around the regulatory side. This is what some people are calling the Tesla model, right? Tesla is allowed to wholly own its factory, wholly own its retail presence in the country. No joint venture requirement whatsoever. In financial services, it's allowing more onshore ownership of operations. So Citigroup, UBS, JP Morgan, each of the major Western financial institutions is allowed to own more and more, if not outright own, its sales, distribution, and brokerages onshore in China in order to recoup more revenues. So these are incremental steps that China is doing to try and lure or maintain capital, because it's going to current account deficit, right? Trade deficit as well. It wants to liberalize its capital account, draw in that portfolio investment from the Western pension funds and asset managers in order to help to clean up its financial system. And in a way, quite frankly, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but this is not an uncommon phenomenon, it basically wants to socialize its toxic assets, right? Wants the world to buy into. I mean, look, this is what the global subprime mortgage crisis was as well, right? So China is also, it's not out of the ordinary, and it's perhaps not surprising that China wants the world to buy its toxic assets. And that's basically what capital account liberalization is to some degree.
That's a very important point, but exactly on the same point, as far as smaller nations are concerned, Gautam, you've looked at geopolitics of South Asia, Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China. How is it going to change, if at all, the relationship between China and the countries in South Asia, particularly, and some countries in Southeast Asia? Do you think there's going to be some change there, some pushback from smaller countries against China, or how is it going to be?
Well, where economics is concerned, as Parag rightly mentioned, it's the money which talks and the money which speaks. So as long as China has surpluses which it can invest in other countries, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it is directly into those countries, there will be takers for, China's money. But I think there will also be a degree of there will be a degree of, some care will be taken by these countries to check that the investment which is coming in is something which can be sustainable, something which can continue forward, and something which can benefit the host nation apart from, from China itself. So I think there is going to be a lot of more questions being asked about all these projects which China does across the world. But if they are sustainable and if they are predictable, I think those projects will go ahead and go forward.
Yeah, so I think not much is going to change, but it will depend on the political situation in each of the country individually, I suppose, going forward. But that's the way. One final question to you, Parag. Are we looking at a deep and a long recession world over?
Well, worldwide, it's hard to say how long the contractions will last in each economy. And let's remember that there are many predictions of, a either a V or a U. I would say a W. Some say for some industries a swoosh like Nike. I mean, a big down, then a very slow recovery like aviation, hospitality. These things will be firm by firm, sector by sector, country by country, depending on the extent to which the economies are domestic services oriented economies. And if you are a large market like China, mostly driven by domestic goods and services and consumption and investment, then you can propel yourself forward or either artificially, temporarily, but then there is again that rebound effect. India again fits that description. India ticks those boxes. It should be a place where a weaker currency and the ability to reform and draw in capital, plus a large population and a very, very low oil price, let's remember, all of the stars, again, are fairly aligned for India to actually strengthen its domestic economy coming out of this situation. I haven't even mentioned the word privatization, but in times like this, governments should take advantage of the lagging reforms in privatization that they should have done for the last few years but haven't. And that also brings in foreign capital, makes firms more competitive, shakes up industries and so forth. So again, there are at least 8 obvious things that India could do, that other large economies could do to strengthen themselves in the recovery coming out of this.
Great to know that. And on that note, let me thank both of you before I end. And to our viewers, this is the first of the series of webinars we are doing. Don't forget to like us on our social media handles. And also, of course, keep sending us the feedback. We are a new digital platform, but which looks beyond South Asia. Of course, looking at the neighborhood first. But on that note, thank you both of you for joining, for very insightful thoughts. And we hope to meet again digitally, if not physically in very near future. Thank you, Parag. Thank you, Gautam, for this very insightful discussion.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.